Welcome back for another episode of the AEC Disruptors. Today's guest is Sara Maffey, Head of Industry Relations at LocalLogic. We're really excited to have you, Sara. How are you doing?
I'm great. Thanks for having me. This is going to be fun.
Absolutely. Oh, yeah. Before we get started, maybe set the stage a little bit. I'd like to get to know you. Who are you? And then really, who is LocalLogic?
Yeah, cool. I have worked in a variety of different parts of the built environment throughout my career. I actually started in construction management up in New York as a mechanical superintendent. So I've made some pretty wild pivots in my time. I worked for a period of time in economic development, which has really impacted the way that I think about data and community development. And most recently, I've worked in commercial real estate, and that's what I've been doing up until joining LocalLogic, which is a location intelligence PropTech company.
Before we go too far, I want to know a little bit. What is Local Hippo? I was stalking you and I saw that, and I'm like, oh, I really want to understand what Local Hippo is.
So we'll probably get into it, but I am pretty obsessed with placemaking, and I'm also, I think this kind of ties in with my work with economic development. I'm really interested in supporting local businesses. And so I created these gift boxes, which I think of as micro placemaking, and I curated experiences and things that were locally made. And a lot of my customers were multifamily developments that were giving these gifts as welcome gifts to new residents. And it was really meant to be like, here's a snapshot of everything that you can walk to around your new home, and kind of a little micro placemaking gift. So yeah.
I think that's so cool. Yeah, I'm sure when we talk about placemaking, I think some of that'll make sense. But yeah, when I was doing some research and I saw those things about you, I felt like compelled to ask because I thought it was really an interesting thing. I mean, I've seen things like Birchbox and all these things that people send through the mail as subscription, but then looking at creating these little placemaking gift baskets, I thought was a interesting thing.
Yeah, it's a total passion project.
No, that's awesome. No, I think it's really cool. So LocalLogic, when you go out and you all are sort of trying to sell LocalLogic, what is kind of the big elevator pitch that you give to what LocalLogic is, what it can do for its customers?
I mean, I think what we've done is build a digital twin of cities, and we're really focusing on all those pieces. I think of it as an ecosystem of data. And imagine if you're standing in a place, like, what are all the things that you're observing, taking in subjectively? Are there trees on the street? Are there cute retail shops? Is it accessible for me to walk from point A to point B, or do I have to go under train tracks or over a 4-lane highway? We take in all these pieces of data about the experience of a place, the neighborhood surrounding a site, for example, and we use data to actually quantify that. So we have our location scores, which are really the backbone of all of our insights. And for me, that was really the exciting part of working at LocalLogic, is the fact that we can do that. I think a lot of times folks in real estate are using their very valid experience of a certain submarket or boots on the ground visits, but to be able to do all that with data, I think is where a lot of my former clients were really requiring us to go, and it was hard to get that kind of data. So I think that's really what we bring to the table.
You kind of mentioned in the very beginning this idea of location intelligence. Before we kind of talk about what location intelligence is, one thing I was curious when we were creating these outlines is, in your opinion, do you see a difference between what data is and then intelligence? Yes. What is your thoughts on that?
I think that data can be very messy. It can be require a lot of sort of cleaning and structuring to actually get to an actionable place. And to me, intelligence is, you have used that data, you have cleaned it, you have structured it, you have created insights from it that are actually going to be usable at the end of the day. So that's, I think, what we provide, whether it's with our APIs or our platform.
Sarah, I didn't realize that you worked for a mechanical contractor. Sorry to take a step back, but I too worked for a mechanical contractor, and I
Totally
All
wild.
sister.
yeah, I consider them to be the superior trade contractor. I know it's a little
I think
biased.
they consider themselves to be the superior trade.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I think it's I see I hadn't realized that. So for you to go from there to a place like Local Logic, I think that's really cool. And when I was doing some of the research on it, all this data that you're pulling for the different places, neighborhoods, cities is very objective.
Mhm.
But the use of that data, I feel like can sometimes be really subjective. So whenever you're creating these scores,
Mhm.
which I want to get into later, how do you draw the line between subjective and objective when it comes to the data that you collect?
I mean, we really don't collect any subjective data in our scores. We have over 3,000 data sources, but it's all data. It's not anyone on the team's opinion about a certain area. We don't have people going out and visiting and collecting thoughts on different areas. It's all based on data. So for me, it's like a very clear line. I think that the different use cases that are out there for our customers, they might be using our data to back up something that they feel personally about an area. But I think that's the beauty of using data as a gut check.
So are your typical customers, are they developers coming to you looking for this sort of location intelligence?
Yeah, I would say we have a variety of different customers. We have products that are sort of our original suite of products that are on a lot of home search sites and portals. We have about 90% market share in Canada, and we're growing rapidly in the US with those products. But the data analytics platform that I spend a lot of time working on is really used, I would say, primarily by commercial real estate investors and developers.
So what is it, and it'll kind of lead into this idea of placemaking, but what is it you find that people are coming to you looking for? What information do they feel is relevant when they're sort of perusing all of this location intelligence?
I think we're in a really interesting place economically right now where multifamily is potentially like a better investment than office, I think we could say at the moment. And we also have certain markets, like we've seen a massive migration of people from, to secondary and tertiary cities, I would say, like smaller cities that still provide a real sense of place, but perhaps at a lower price point or just with less congestion than some of our larger cities. And that's not to say that larger cities are dying. I don't believe that at all. But I think there has been a real population migration happening. And so I think what we're seeing then on the investor and developer side is that they might be looking in new markets that they have not worked in before. Maybe they sit in California or New York and they're trying to invest in, I don't know, Denver or Atlanta, and they're not as familiar with where should I go? Like what specific neighborhoods are hot? Where are people moving? Where should I be building? And so I think that our platform allows them to create these custom heat maps based on the criteria that's most important to them. And you can see the whole market, like where are the hotspots based on what you're looking for. And I think it's a really good way of like expanding and quickly understanding a new market and where you should be located. So I think that's kind of like high level. And then again, like I think investment committees, clients are really just looking for more data to back up these decisions that they're making. And they're no longer necessarily going to be okay with just hearing someone's opinion on a certain location. And the fact that our location scores objectively quantify things that they care about, like being near certain restaurants, grocery stores, access to all different types of transit, and the feeling of the place, I think that's helping make those decisions based on data, and especially with, I think, all the uncertainty right now, that's what people need.
I know like in our area we live, we kind of metro Atlanta, and our office is, 45 minutes away, more localized. But obviously because of COVID, everyone going remote, everybody sort of retooled their perspective of where the office needs to be. Well, and so what we've seen is, and I just saw this just the other day, that a developer from California is coming out and right near us. So we're kind of, again, a little more rural area, developing, 1,500 home new neighborhood. And, it is interesting to think that that individual, who again is from California, is identifying our area as an up and coming area, but they're also, I would hope, is taking into account some of this type of information as to what's nearby. We have a lot of new restaurants happening. We have a lot of new schools that are being developed. Is that all the type of, is that all information that you find or that sort of shows up in your platform?
Yes, absolutely. We have a depending on the different level of school, we have elementary, high school scores, we have restaurant score. So yeah, all of that is what we consider to be value drivers, and part of the machine learning that we're doing behind the scenes too, to try to help people understand, like, I think people sometimes have an idea of what they think the value drivers of change are in an area, and sometimes they're actually like lagging indicators. Like there were actually data points that you could have seen prior to that caused those restaurants to start coming, or those new schools to open. So that's really where we're trying to get at, is being able to use data to see those things earlier and predict where how areas will change.
I think that's a really interesting concept because of, again, going back to this huge neighborhood coming, it could have been either way. I mean, I guess the neighborhood could have come because there were restaurants, but it could have also been that there's a previous neighborhood of that size came because they knew there was a location for a new school. They knew there was going to be a lot of commercial development, or at least a zone for commercial. So they started to have some of those predictive measures. We've talked all around it, but I know placemaking is very important to you, based on a lot of the things we've already talked about. How would you sort of level set? How would you define what placemaking is? And then how is local logic really helping to develop places?
To me, placemaking is elevating the sense of place that might already exist. That's kind of an ideal situation when you're in an existing neighborhood, for example. But I think that there's a lot of development now that's, kind of blue ocean, creating that sense of place. And for me, the way that I think about placemaking, it's really almost like the Venn diagram of people and places. A lot of it is really about the experience that we have, human-centric design, the kinds of retail that are available, the kinds of programming, whether it's like music in the evening or just kind of community building, social connectivity that is created in a place. That's how I would define placemaking.
Is that what really spurred your passion for local Hippo?
It is. Yes, I am such a placemaking nerd. I think, so I went to school for architecture and urban design. And I think the way I kind of describe how I think about this, because in my prior job, I was leading placemaking really on the office side. And that's not normally how urban designers, urban planners think about placemaking. I think normally it's talked about in more of like an urban public setting, in public spaces. But I think that there's this confluence of that public space, and there's been so much talk about like workplace strategy. And for me, the connection is like, we're paying more attention to how we interact with space and how we can interact with each other more meaningfully. And I think that's what placemaking does. And it doesn't matter what asset type we're talking about or what context. It's really about thinking about, how does this place support and encourage that kind of social connectivity and experience of the people in it.
Which is really interesting when we're in a time where I have a young daughter. And so the idea of lots of people is scary,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
So, how do we balance this idea of designing an appropriate place, but then also keeping, this whole pandemic is something none of us ever really thought about. Is
Yeah.
that something we need to start considering when we do these placemaking scores and thinking about it?
Well, I would say, I think that our scores support placemaking decisions, but I think the idea of placemaking, there's so many interesting examples of how people have been trying to experiment with this virtually, over the last year and a half. Because we're, and I think there is some Zoom fatigue and things like that of like how to accomplish that. But I think on the sort of physical spaces side, what we've seen is more interest in outdoor space, for example, like just knowing that there are parks nearby, that you're going to have access to maybe go have coffee and sit outside. Like that kind of stuff is a lot more important to people now. And I think that they're making decisions on where their homes are and where their offices are based on access to those kinds of things that maybe wouldn't have been priorities before going through this massive shift in how we live.
We look for lunch places based on how close they are to a park, so that we can do takeout. It doesn't get cold by the time we get there, that we can go. But then what's interesting is then we get there and now we judge parks based on shade. Like what parks have more, there's a really nice park nearby, but there's not a single tree around.
Yeah.
So all of those things were things that we never did car picnics. We never really ate in the park, that we find ourselves doing now.
And by the way, like our park score would have a lower score if there were not actually decent tree coverage in the park. That's part of what we're considering in that score. We have a lot of nuance going on.
I think that's
does it
great.
take into account deciduous and non-deciduous trees for wintertime?
That is a great question. I will have to ask that question.
I'm interested in how, because since the pandemic, there's been a lot of dominoes that have fallen, whether it be people realizing that, they don't need to go in the office every day. It's more important for them to find a place to work where they're comfortable as well as productive, no matter where that is. So there's been a lot of people moving around. I moved over the past couple of years myself. And, we just had the latest edition of the US Census that's come out. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious how things like the census impact, the scores that Local Logic puts out.
I don't know that our scores are as connected to census data, but we do make demographic data available in our platform. It's actually one of our, also a popular API that we offer. Mm-hmm. And the way that we think about it, I think if you've ever looked at a census map, I know that's kind of like a nerdy thing, but coming from economic development, I've looked at a lot of census maps. The shapes of these tracks can be they don't make a lot of sense sometimes. They're kind of wonky and sometimes can be very large. And when you're using that kind of public data that is sort of like almost like a data dump, it doesn't have any insights, that difference between intelligence and data. It can be hard to make decisions using those large tracks. So what we try to do is actually look at like a 5-minute walk around a site and be really targeted with how we think about demographics, like who really lives within a 5-minute walk around this site. And we weight any census tracts accordingly to fit within that radius. And I think that that's way more usable than saying, I'm right on the edge of these two massive census tracts. I'm going to take all of that data and try to make sense of that in decision-making. So while it's not necessarily like a part of our scores, it is a really big part of decision-making and a data point that we make available.
Are you all I think you are, because I've seen it in some of your articles, but the concept of the 15-minute city, does that theory or concept, do you feel like plays heavily in how you all are approaching your numbers and scores?
Yes, very much so. Our scores right now are really based on the walkability, the access to all of these different things, whether it's schools, grocery stores, that's a big part of our scores. And so our scores are perfect for a 15-minute city, to understand what's within a reasonable walk of a site. I think where we're going is, there's almost like a second version of a 15-minute city in more driving cities that I think it's still a 15-minute city. It's just in your car that people are willing to kind of go that far. And it kind of expands the radius that we're talking about in terms of understanding what kind of amenities and services are available. But I would say overall, I think what we've seen over the last year and a half is people just aren't necessarily going as far from home, whether that's driving or walking. You're kind of doing everything a little bit closer, and our scores are really helpful for that.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. A 15-minute neighborhood is going to be a whole lot different in New York City rather than somewhere that's super spread out like Houston or something like that.
Well, I live in Atlanta, and I think what I consider close within 15 minutes is definitely not something I would walk to. But it's still, I think, in my 15-minute radius,
I mean, it takes me 20 minutes to get to the interstate from where I live. So, I mean, it really starts to cut off where you can go. I mean, something that always would bug me is I'd go for a run or something, and you'd see a cul-de-sac of a very long neighborhood that's like backs right up to like a parkway. And you just know that person has to drive through their very long neighborhood to get back to that parkway. So, I mean, and it's a little off topic, but, with your urban design background and, during this whole pandemic, a lot of us have sort of retreated home. We're working from home. We're looking at spaces around us, and we're developing in spaces around us, but it kind of conflicts with the idea of urban sprawl. Do you think there's a middle ground behind managing urban sprawl, which I know a lot of urban designers and city planners really like to pay attention to, but also creating the accommodations that so many of us really are sort of yearning for?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's really rare to see apartments now without some element of retail. And I also think that there's been, and maybe this is impacted by the fact that I do live in Atlanta, where we're really focusing on creating density within the ITP. You know what I'm talking about, Chris, within the perimeter. I think that's all being supported. I mean, there's just more of a densification happening with the amount of housing that's going on sites. And I think it's interesting. We really started with this residential focus, but what I'm seeing more and more is the use of our scores to understand like what kind of retail needs to be programmed into the bottom of this, 5-story apartment building. That I think previously it might be going into a neighborhood where there is a lot of single family homes and maybe duplexes and things like that. And maybe this is near transit and that's why it's being allowed, et cetera. But I think there's mixed use is really a good solution, I think, as we think about that.
I absolutely could agree with that.
Are there ever any situations where, what would be, a perfect fit for a neighborhood can't be there due to zoning or things like that?
Sure. I mean, I think that, this might be going in kind of a different direction, but zoning, I think, you can always get a variance. You can go to the neighborhood, work with them to change what the zoning is, if that really is a perfect fit for the neighborhood and what the community wants as well, not just, what might make the most sense ROI wise for the developer. But I think that's where we want to go with our data, because as you mentioned before, like a lot of our early adopters on the analytics side are developers and investors, but a lot of us at Local Logic, especially our co-founders, have this kind of nerdy urban planning, urban design background. And we see a world where making this kind of data available also to communities and municipalities will help make those decisions better. It's sort of like when you have data that's so siloed and only one of the stakeholder groups has access to it, then you're really missing out on, I think, a lot of basis for good conversation and compromise and making those kinds of changes that might actually benefit everyone. But there isn't an open dialogue happening. A lot of times the public feedback that comes on a project is relatively late in the process, like maybe you already own the property and now you're just trying to get this thing approved by the neighborhood, approved by the planning unit, et cetera, and going up the stages. But wouldn't it be nice if there was a way to begin that conversation from just a way of knowing, like, what does the community actually want there? And what is the city trying to solve for in that location? And I think that's where we have this vision of going, is being able to sort of connect those three legs of the stool and make communities that actually are just based on data-driven decisions that actually serve everybody so much better.
I would love that, because I feel like there's few, at least in our general area around here, there's few master plan communities where they like thought through even at a high level some of the things that they want. So much like when we drive down some of the local areas, it seems so reactive. Like, oh, there was some land, let's put a Chipotle. Oh, there was some land, let's plop a Chick-fil-A. Oh, we need a gas station over here. But it was really just based on, does the site fit what we need and is it zoned right? I would love to see more communities pairing with the information, actually plan them out and think through, even like how big does my parkway need to be so that it could support what I hope to be a bunch of retail and, shops and all the type things that go with it. It just,
or perhaps maybe, yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, perhaps maybe investing more in mass transit, or knowing, I think that there's a lot of inequities that can be unearthed by looking at the data, and you can easily see, what neighborhoods really lack trees and parks and access to grocery stores, for example. And when you have that kind of information as a city, then maybe that's an ask that you ask of a developer that's coming into that area, so that the community that already is there can be served in some way by this new investment in the community, instead of making it feel a little bit more random. Although I think that Chipotle probably uses a lot of data.
I'm sure they do.
Decisions on where they go.
That was a bad example, just because they're building
Chick-fil-A
this new Chipotle.
too.
Yeah, I know. They're right across from each other. It's like the worst two examples, because I know that because we work with Chick-fil-A, so I know what they use.
Yeah.
When you mentioned it a little bit, and when we start to talk about like what does the future look like for stuff like this, you talked about how neighborhoods could start to predict their needs. Talk a little bit about that. What exactly do you mean, and what do you hope that your platform can start to do, so that, and we kind of already touched on it, but that the communities can start to predict, so we know how they're going to change over time?
Yeah, I think that there's so many, what I'll just probably keep calling like value driving factors. And we're doing the modeling behind the scenes so that we understand like what those things are. And sometimes it really is noticing changes in demographics. A lot of times there's a specific investment that might spur this in a neighborhood. Like there's an example in Oakland of a theater that, the area changed incredibly rapidly after somebody invested in this theater and reopened it. So it's like, how do you find something like that is kind of a one-off, but can you understand where new transit stops are going to be, and the impact of something like that on how a neighborhood's going to change? Do you see a certain education level suddenly moving into an area because maybe other neighborhoods have become too expensive, and now there's sort of like this, I'm using my hands and we're on a podcast, so I have to think of like
there'll be a video component. It's fine.
Expansion into these other neighborhoods. And so maybe it's the start of a rapid opening of multiple coffee shops or multiple bars or multiple tattoo studios. There's just certain things, and it's going to differ based on the market, what those drivers are. But what we have done is basically a cluster analysis. Like we can do this for specific sites. We'll say, maybe a client has a certain site. We can look at sites that were similar to that in that same city, but perhaps in different neighborhoods and in other cities, and map out all of those different factors with data of how that site, that surrounding neighborhood changed over the last 5 to 10 years. And then you can take those learnings and apply it to the site at hand. And so we've done this quite a few times in sort of more consulting type projects. And what we're working on right now is the ability to actually do that in our platform and in a more, scalable way, instead of just sort of one-off projects.
It's perfect timing with the new infrastructure bill. I'm sure
Yeah.
that's going to really, change a lot of things, and it's the perfect time for that.
Yeah, I think one of the pain points that we hear is just like a lot of this data is available, but it is really hard to access. And then even if you do access it, like it might just be kind of overwhelming, like what am I going to do with all this? Or am I really going to try to track down where this new subway stop is going to be? And a lot of times information is gleaned from reading newspaper articles that might mention something that's coming 5 years from now. And by the time, it gets a little bit lost in the shuffle. So we're really trying to actually make that data available. And so you don't have to go down all these different rabbit holes trying to figure out the different pieces that are going to impact your site.
So do you get the sense that, or at least maybe on the development side, or maybe the hope that a lot of developers are using this type of intelligence to decide where they go? Or do you feel like that it's still early in the process of people adopting data to identify sites?
I would say we're early in the process. I think what's interesting to me is trying to understand better the proxies that people are currently using that are more subjective, and making the connection to the data that they could actually be using to make the decision. I think a lot of it is hearsay from brokers, or insisting on doing boots on the ground, but you get a really narrow view. You're getting your personal opinion or someone else's personal opinion. And to be honest, that might not be how your ideal future resident would feel about a certain location. Those personas might be really different. So I think that there's a lot of awareness right now in commercial real estate that we should be using more data. I think that, as I said before, sometimes that data is really overwhelming, and sometimes firms don't have the capacity in-house to clean, structure, create insights. We have a whole company. We have a whole company dedicated to doing that. So for especially, mid-size, smaller firms, that's a huge undertaking, and it's a real risk. And so I think hopefully by creating this data analytics platform, that sort of lowers the barrier to entry of using data. But we're early in the process. And I think, just kind of sharing good case studies, getting out there, it's going to be a little bit of an adoption curve, like anything else.
I mean, I love the idea of how even like the local cities, municipalities could use data for, planning out schools and some of those more public institutions that we have, that they could do it more on intelligence and need. If we're tapping into demographics, we have a better understanding of where all the schools need to be, or all the senior living facilities. So, my hope would be that they are, because in my example, a guy or a developer in California, there's no way they know a ton about Paulding County, Georgia. And, I'm sure they do outside of going and visiting. But those are two completely different types of individuals, the person that's developing and the person that's going to use it. So it is exciting to hope that people are going to start pulling out the data a little bit more.
Yeah, I think especially on the city side, there are certain cities who are really trying to embrace, IoT and all these sort of smart city technologies that are out there. I think it would be cool to, a lot of that to me is, I guess it is being used in some sense to decide on services and things like that, but it feels very micro experience to me, that smart city, a lot of the data that's involved in that. And so I think some of our data, especially with our AI, like AVMs, and just trying to understand how neighborhoods are changing, instead of just using a snapshot of what's happening today, to actually be able to predict how a neighborhood's going to change, that married with some of the IoT, level data that they're already capturing, I think could be sort of a next level of intelligence in making those decisions.
I was reading on your website
Mhm.
and I saw all of these different scores, and the one that caught my attention the most was the vibrancy score.
That's a fan favorite. Yeah.
So what plays into a vibrancy score?
Yeah. No, go ahead.
Yeah, how does a neighborhood, what are some of the things that go into having a high vibrancy score?
I love that you picked this one, because before I even joined Local Logic, this was like my score that I got really hooked on, because I think it's like a perfect example of like vibrancy that feels so subjective, but actually it's really not. So we look at things like, not only are there restaurants and bars around the site, but we also look at cultural things to do, things that actually like give you that sense of vibrancy, whether it's like art studios or music venues or comedy, clubs, things like that. And it's also looking at like, where I grew up in New Jersey, everything closes at 6. I would give it a very low vibrancy score. But there are, a lot of neighborhoods that are like 18-hour neighborhoods. That's kind of like, I would say really big in like secondary and tertiary cities versus like 24/7 neighborhoods. So understanding data on like how late are these things open? Can I go get a cup of coffee at 10:30 and like, hang out with friends and have sort of that vibrancy of urban life in this location? We use all sorts of data to be able to quantify that. So
if you're ever wondering, a Dunkin' Donuts closes at 9 and their donuts are not good. We found that out talking about vibrancy. If you want donuts, don't go at when they close. They're
I think that's
very limited. Yeah. I tried.
So it sounds to me like high vibrancy is a high sense of community within a neighborhood.
Well, I think it's a high level of things that would foster a sense of community. Mm-hmm.
I like that.
That's a good way. I really do appreciate you joining us today. It was interesting to kind of hear about what Local Logic is doing. So as we round up, I mean, what's your advice to those that are maybe considering getting into using the data, but feel like they don't have that expertise?
I would just say our platform is really easy to use. That's feedback that I get all the time. And it's, we're looking for early adopters to give us feedback as we add more features and data to it. And I think that that's a pretty low stakes way of testing out, would data help you? You don't have to invest in purchasing data on your own. You don't have to invest in the ability to make sense of it all and actually turn it into intelligence and actionable insights. So I would say, please give me a shout, like we'll get you set up and like just try out the analytics platform, because I think that's a good starting place if that's something that you're interested in testing.
Yeah, it sounds to me like, in the construction industry, we are just now getting around to trying to harness our data for good and for, knowing how to build better projects in the future. In terms of placemaking, it sounds like you all have a grasp on that.
I am like excited to come to work every day because I get to talk about the things that I nerdily love. So yeah, I think we're headed in a really good direction. We've got a cool product right now.
That's exciting. Well, I appreciate you joining us. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. All right, let me see.